where you see the passing of time.
The crowds in St. Peter's Square are praying like mad for the Pope's light.
Where moments refuse to die.
This is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe.
And where victory lives on.
Plenty of girls are being kissed by plenty of boys they don't know, and they do not care.
You can love it, hate it, embrace it, or turn away.
Lenin was shot to death late last night outside his apartment building.
But it is a past we all share.
Come on out here and give me a salute. Big Navy salute.
This is where yesterday has a home, where we wonder what it was like back then.
Go forward, knights, in safety.
And not too long ago.
His spirit must live on.
It's where history has its place and where the past comes alive. The History Channel.
In the late 1940s and the 50s, an epidemic of fear swept across America, a fear of communist aggression abroad, coupled with the divisive fear of communist subversion at home. As a result, many decent American citizens found their patriotism challenged by unknown accusers, their reputations ruined, their careers destroyed, all in the name of national security. It was a bad time for America, but a few courageous citizens chose to fight back. Case in point, Milo Radulovich.
CBS television presents...
In October of 1953, Edward R. Murrow devoted his television program See It Now to the case of a young officer in the Air Force Reserve accused of violating Regulation 3562.
That is a regulation which states that a man may be regarded as a security risk if he has close and continuing association with communist or people believed to have communist sympathies. Lieutenant Radulovich was asked to resign in August. He declined. A board was called and heard his case. At the end, it was recommended that he be severed from the Air Force, although it was also stated that there was no question whatever as to the lieutenant's loyalty.
So they have reiterated that on several occasions.
Radulovich, a college physics student with 10 years of active duty behind him, demanded the Air Force give him a hearing.
Anybody that is labeled with a security risk in these days, especially in physics or meteorology, simply won't be able to find employment in his field of work.
No reporters were allowed to cover the military hearing. The lieutenant was defended by a civilian attorney, Charles Lockwood.
The Air Force did not produce a single witness. We were not told who the accusers were. We had no right to confront them or to cross-examine them.
The problem was not with Milo, but with people he had grown up with, his sister and his father.
The actual charge against me is that I have maintained a close and continuing relationship with my dad and my sister over the years.
Radulovich's father apparently made the mistake of reading a newspaper favorable to Yugoslavia's communist leader, Josip Broz Tito, while Milo's sister, Margaret Radulovich Fishman, neither defended nor explained her political activities.
I mean, since when can a man be adjudged guilty, which is in effect what has happened to him, because of the alleged political beliefs or activities of a member of his family?
But that is exactly what happened. The board recommended that Radulovich be booted out of the service.
In all the 32 years that I have been a practicing attorney in Detroit, I have never witnessed such a farce and travesty upon justice as this thing has developed.
The case would eventually reach the Secretary of the Air Force, and 5 weeks later, Air Force Secretary Harold Talbot appeared on See It Now, where he reversed the decision.
The question raised as to security had thus been resolved in Lieutenant Radulovich's favor. And I have therefore directed that Lieutenant Radulovich be retained in his present status in the United States Air Force.
Milo Radulovich was lucky. He got his commission and his reputation back. But that was not true for thousands of other Americans who were being denied fair hearings and due process, all in the name of national security. Why? Well, for many Americans, the world seemed to be spinning out of control.
America seems to be the most powerful, the most moral nation on earth, and yet it is losing everywhere to the communists. Eastern Europe is going communist. China just goes to the communists. How do you explain this?
It was true that China had fallen to the communists. It was also true that professional Soviet spies, with the help of a few American traitors, had successfully stolen America's greatest secret. The Soviet Union now had the atomic bomb, and a nuclear World War III suddenly had become a real possibility.
Duck and cover.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Since it may be used against us, we must get ready for it. That's why these children are practicing to duck and cover just as you do in your school.
Americans built bomb shelters and stockpiled food. And just as in World War II, they kept sharp lookout for homegrown spies and saboteurs.
They really feared communism. After all, we were engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. Communism was the greatest menace to our lives, to our welfare, to our security.
As a result, being labeled a communist could carry serious consequences, as Hollywood movie director Edward Dmytryk recalls.
Being dubbed a communist was worse than being dubbed a murderer, a wife killer, a rapist, or anything in those days.
Yes, a communist was a four-letter word. To be accused of being a communist was essentially to be accused of being a traitor, to being thoroughly un-American.
That's what happened in this country. It was really the Inquisition. People were being charged with being communists. Once you were charged with being a communist, you were dead. Completely dead.
The perceived threat of communism was so frightening to many Americans that they were willing to stand by and do nothing as traditional American principles of justice were overturned, all in the name of national security. The television program on Milo Radulovich tried to change that kind of thinking. Instead, Murrow and his staff got a taste of just how menacing the climate of fear was. The See It Now producer, Joe Wershba, while on assignment in Washington, ran into Don Serene, who was on the staff of a Republican senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy.
Serene comes over and says, "Joe, what's this Radwich junk you people are putting out?" Radwich. I knew he meant Radulovich, and I knew that, boy, here it comes now. And I said, well, listen, Don, I got to get this film back to New York fast. It was film in those days. He says, you come on with me and I'll show you. What would you say if I told you that Murrow was on the Soviet payroll?
Wershba was frightened by the remark because it was a clear indication that no one was immune from the climate of fear sweeping the nation. When Joseph Persico was writing a biography of Edward R. Murrow many years later, he asked the FBI to send whatever it had on Murrow in its files.
I got back 1,000 pages. You would have thought that I had asked for the file on Vladimir Lenin, not an upstanding American.
The 7-inch thick, 1,354-page FBI file on Edward R. Murrow is just one of tens of thousands that the Federal Bureau of Investigation accumulated on American citizens. Files bulging with unsupported allegations of disloyalty and reckless charges of subversion. Such files were proof that Americans had become frightened not just of Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, but of one another. And some politicians were quick to exploit that fear for their own narrow political purposes.
The Republican Party, and particularly the isolationist wing in the center of the country, had been out of power and had lost 5 elections in a row. And they understand that Roosevelt has so changed the demographics of the country with the New Deal and those reforms that they cannot campaign on economic issues. So they have to seize on the issue of subversion, implying that the Democrats have been in cahoots with the communists.
The actual number of Americans who were hardcore, card-carrying, dues-paying members of the Communist Party was never more than 0.1% of the population of the United States, even during the depth of the Depression. And it's likely the FBI knew just who all of them were. The real Soviet agents and spies, the ones who managed to steal the secrets of the atomic bomb, for example, wouldn't be caught dead at a Communist Party meeting. But the party members, and those who had only flirted with the Communist Party in their youth, They made easy targets for politicians looking for someone to blame for the reversal of America's fortunes in the post-war world.
We must have order in these chambers.
In 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee went to Hollywood to investigate allegations of communist subversion of the American movie industry. And it was quite a show.
Go ahead with it. Everyone please sit down.
The first HUAC witnesses were famous and friendly and eager to please.
I have never read Karl Marx, and I don't know the basis of communism beyond what I've picked up from hearsay. What I've heard, I don't like it.
I would move to the state of Texas if it ever came here, because I think the Texans would kill him on sight.
Then came the unfriendly witnesses.
We're going to get the answer to that question if we have to stay here for a week.
And the fireworks that made the hearings front-page news.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
I'm framing my answer in the only way in which any American citizen can frame his
then
answer
you denied,
to a question
then you,
which invades his, absolutely invades
then
his
you
right.
denied.
In the end, 7 screenwriters, 2 directors, and 1 producer refused to answer the committee's questions, and they became what was known as the Hollywood 10. All of them went to jail for contempt of Congress, including 2-time Oscar-winning screenwriter Ring Lardner Jr. and Hollywood movie director Edward Dmytryk.
We thought that we had a right to believe what we wanted to believe, and even though I wasn't a communist, I thought everybody, there was no law against communism in this country, and I believed that everybody, in other words, it was a matter of principle.
And we had come to the conclusion that the only way to handle this was not to answer the questions.
I can belong to any party that I see fit to join, and you have no right to invite it.
So, you fight a battle, you lose it, you know, you suffer. You don't cry. You take your beating. Isn't that what you do? Isn't that the old American spirit?
Those who resisted the congressman were the exception rather than the rule. Most of Hollywood seemed willing to cooperate. As a result, more than 300 writers, directors, and actors, all suspected of being communists, or of knowing communists, or of having communist sympathies, were put out of work, blacklisted by the movie industry, with no chance to refute the allegations.
Hollywood was closed down as far as we were concerned.
My wife was also blacklisted in the business simply because she was my wife, not because she was a communist, because she certainly never was.
There were no heroes and no villains, only victims on both sides.
Blacklisting swept the country. The pamphlet called Red Channels appeared, claiming to be a who's who of communists and communist sympathizers in the arts.
Murrow saw his own network knuckle under to a blacklist on hiring, to the requirement of a loyalty oath, which he found demeaning for himself and the rest of Murrow's boys.
Red Channels named a lot of famous Americans who, as a result, found employment difficult or impossible to find. Among those named by Red Channels, composer Aaron Copland, writer Dashiell Hammett, poet Langston Hughes, playwright Lillian Hellman, harmonica player Larry Adler, actors Lee J. Cobb, Gail Sondergaard, Jose Ferrer, Ruth Gordon, Zero Mostel, and the legendary Orson Welles.
The Bill of Rights was established precisely to prevent the operation of any committee which could invade the basic rights of Americans. Now, if you want to know...
Mr. Chairman, the witness not answering the question I submitted.
To understand the mood of the times and what it meant to be tangled up in the web of a witch hunt, consider Bartley Crum, a California attorney who paid a terribly high price for representing reported communists.
The only thing I feel guilty about is getting Bartley Crum, and I had no way of knowing that would happen, of getting Bartley Crum into this situation. He didn't deserve it. He was a wonderful man. He really was a wonderful man.
Bartley Crum was director Edward Dmytryk's lawyer, and he represented other members of the Hollywood 10.
FBI agents trailed my father from San Francisco to Chicago to New York on the train. He knew that they were tailing him, and he got to New York finally, and he lost them by running into St. Patrick's. He said he knew that they would not follow him into a house of worship. And he was harassed constantly by the FBI.
His was a really great tragedy in this whole damn thing, because his career was completely ruined by representing us as a lawyer, which is pretty ridiculous, isn't it? A lawyer represents murderers, and it doesn't hurt his career. He represents criminals. It doesn't hurt his career. But he was blackballed, blacklisted by almost everybody. And Christ, it was sad to see. I don't know how he stood it. It is so un-American to judge people unfairly by their associations. And he eventually killed himself because it's just the world was against him. A lawyer, for Christ's sake, is supposed to be able to represent anybody.
The chair will determine what's in the purview of this committee, not you.
What was lost in the wave of accusations was a critical distinction. A distinction between confusion and commitment.
Nobody wanted America to be subverted by an alien influence, but there's a great deal of difference between some politically clumsy person who's made a wrong political choice in a time like the Depression and someone who is a sworn part of a communist apparatus.
From an attention-getting viewpoint, the HUAC hearings in Hollywood were a smashing success, like pouring gasoline on a campfire.
And you'll be responsive to the questions, or you'll be excused from the witness stand.
The hearings were for publicity's sake, not for digging up who was a communist and who wasn't a communist.
Stand away from the stand.
For Americanism for many years, and I
stand away from the stand.
For the Bill of Rights, which
Officer, take this man away from the stand.
From Hollywood, the focus quickly shifted back to Washington and the Democrats. Capitol Hill Republicans didn't think twice now about openly calling the Democratic Party the party of treason. Representative Robert Rich of Pennsylvania charged that Secretary of State Dean Acheson was on Joseph Stalin's payroll. And Senator Robert Taft of Ohio told reporters, quote, "The only way to get rid of communists in the State Department is to change the head of the government." And Republicans didn't stop with rhetoric alone. They wanted to find a prominent Democrat in the State Department whom they could claim had been a bona fide communist agent. And in 1948, a freshman congressman from California named Richard Nixon hit pay dirt.
When did you last see Mr. Hiss?
A self-confessed former communist named Whittaker Chambers testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee that a prominent, respected, highly placed Democrat named Alger Hiss had helped him spy for the Soviet Union in the 1930s when, Chambers said, both were members of the Communist Party.
The statements about me made by Mr. Chambers are complete fabrications. I think my record in the government service speaks for itself.
But Alger Hiss could not get off that easily. Whittaker Chambers, vigorously supported by Congressman Richard Nixon, maintained that Hiss was lying.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting and I am fighting.
Then Chambers delivered the deadly blow, charging that Hiss had given him microfilm copies of secret documents. Chambers led government agents to his Maryland farm, where the microfilm was found in a hollowed-out pumpkin. It promptly became known as the Pumpkin Papers. Congressman Richard Nixon, who had vigorously questioned Hiss, seized on the microfilm evidence. With a committee counsel by his side, Nixon called a news conference.
This microfilm was made for the purpose of transmitting these documents in reduced form to the Soviet Union. The documents were obtained from State Department employees who were communists and who were interested in sending those documents to the Soviet Union, where the interests of the Soviet Union were in direct conflict with the United States.
Eventually, the complicated case wound up in federal court where Alger Hiss was convicted, not of espionage, but of perjury. Now, for certain, the issue of communist subversion of the Democratic administration had become a respectable issue to raise. One Republican politician who was deeply impressed by Congressman Richard Nixon's sudden rise to prominence was the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joseph R. McCarthy. But he had a problem. A poll of Washington correspondents had just named McCarthy America's worst senator. Worried about his chances for re-election in 1952, McCarthy desperately needed a campaign issue, and he found it in the Red Menace.
He came to me after he discovered the communist issue and said he had nothing and that he needed some help. And he asked me whether I had anything in my files.
McCarthy's ambition was simply to raise hell, get reelected, get himself in the headlines.
I mean, he had no names. In fact, I was sitting in his office when he called Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was then I believe, chairman of the Un-American Activities Committee, or at least active in the Un-American Activities Committee. And he told Richard Nixon the same thing that he told me. He said, I've got a hot issue. I think that we can push this issue, but I don't have anything to back it up. He didn't quite put it that baldly, but that was the sense of it.
So, in February of 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy, still lacking hard evidence but armed with a clipping of a Nixon speech and his own imagination, embarked on a weekend speaking tour. In Wheeling, West Virginia, he told a Republican women's club that he held in his hand a list of 205 Communist Party members known to the Secretary of State, but still working in the State Department. By the time McCarthy changed planes in Denver on his way to Reno, the number had changed to 57. The Denver Post photographer took this picture of McCarthy rummaging through his briefcase in search of his elusive list of 57 State Department subversives. Back in Washington, the number became 81.
What had always worked for him was hit and run. A speech in St. Louis today attacking the communists and giving out a list, 128 communists, and then you get on the plane or the train and you go to Chicago and you give out another speech and another list, and you're never there to answer the charge, and then you're on to Omaha and you give another speech and another number. He was always staying, in effect, one step ahead of the sheriff.
Senator Joseph McCarthy did not create the epidemic of fear in the United States, but no politician exploited national anxieties more effectively than he. Many Republicans deplored the methods of his anti-communist crusade, but many cheered him on. He was, after all, crusading against Democrats, and there was a presidential election coming up in 1952. One Democrat high on McCarthy's hit list was Millard Tydings, that veteran senator from Maryland, who had exposed McCarthy's empty allegations of subversives in the State Department. McCarthy campaigned against Tydings hard and dirty. By criticizing McCarthy, said McCarthy, Tydings proved that he was soft on communism and worse.
Here is a picture of myself, allegedly in communication with Earl Browder, the head of the Communist Party. This picture is two separate pictures taken at different times and put together. This is my picture listening to election returns taken 12 years before this picture was made. And this is a picture of Earl Browder. The two separate pictures were then put together, trying to portray that I was in communication and talking to Earl Browder, which was a complete lie. But that is the kind of stuff that was used in this campaign.
Tydings lost his first election defeat in 28 years. So did three other Democratic senators McCarthy had campaigned against. Democrats were appalled by his gutter tactics. Most Republicans were elated. McCarthy was a political force to be reckoned with, more devastating to the Democrats than even Richard Nixon.
Joe McCarthy believed that compared to him, Richard Nixon was a Quaker in a tuxedo. You didn't fight communists with laws. You didn't fight it with any sort of legislation. What you did was to grab them by the throat, take them in the street, shine a flashlight in their face, and beat the hell out of them.
Herbert Bloch, political cartoonist for the Washington Post, put a new word into the American lexicon with this cartoon showing GOP leaders pushing a reluctant Republican elephant toward a tower of buckets overflowing with mud and tar. Herblock labeled the barrel on top McCarthyism, and the term stuck. But McCarthy sneered at such criticism. McCarthyism, he would tell his audiences, is Americanism with its sleeves rolled up.
And the place would go crazy. The audience would erupt.
This fight to expose those who would destroy this nation will go on and on.
Joe McCarthy had a proletarian charm, kind of all the appeal of a tramp dog wagging its tail.
The Gallup polls consistently showed that 50% of the American people had a favorable opinion of Joe McCarthy and thought he was helping the country. With his sweeping shotgun allegations about communist subversion, he'd come out of nowhere to become one of the most popular and most feared politicians in the nation. And he got a lot of help from the press.
McCarthy understood the rhythm of reporters. He knew they had deadlines. He knew they loved to be fed stories. And he knew that what he told them would largely come out as he said it. They were, in fact, a conveyor belt for his misinformation.
And so they deserve some of the responsibility for what he did, what he turned out to be.
He played them like a yo-yo, and they were glad to be the yo-yo in general. Hey, I'm just doing my job. He's a senator, he said it.
The Republicans swept the election of 1952. They controlled both houses of Congress now. Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House, and Joseph McCarthy now chaired the Senate's Permanent Investigations Committee with the power to subpoena witnesses.
Mrs. Morse, that Morse or Morse? Say that you never have been a member of the Communist Party?
No, sir, I have not.
When the Republicans come into power in 1953, they now turn to McCarthy and they say, Joe, thank you very much. You've done a great job. You've helped us win the election. But now it's time for you to quiet down, because if you keep attacking, you are going to be attacking your own party. You're going to be attacking your own White House. And what McCarthy begins to say is, I'm not going to stop. I like this. I like the publicity. This is fun.
A few days ago, I read that President Eisenhower expressed the hope that by election time in 1954, the subject of communism would be a dead and forgotten issue. The raw, harsh, unpleasant fact is that communism is an issue and will be an issue in 1954.
He intimidated the biggest people in the government, including his own president, Dwight Eisenhower.
By 1954, McCarthy seemed out of control.
Why didn't you go to the confidential file?
His own or anybody else's, holding public hearings about communist subversion in the U.S. Army. He was attacked by critics, and there were lots of them in the newspapers and on the radio, but the criticism made no difference.
He was a brawler, and he loved the battle. He was a boxer in college.
If fighting communists and getting a bit rough with them is un-American, then I must plead guilty to being un-American.
And he wouldn't know the difference between Karl Marx and Groucho Marx. I mean, he didn't care.
This is a document that shows...
Still, McCarthy rolled on ever more recklessly. But then, something extraordinary happened to Joe McCarthy. Edward R. Murrow put him on television.
Good evening. Tonight, See It Now devotes its entire half hour to a report on Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, told mainly in his own words and pictures.
And wait till you hear the bleeding hearts scream and cry about our methods of trying to drag the truth from those who know or should know who covered up a Fifth Amendment communist major.
There was Joe McCarthy on national television. And what McCarthy was shown saying about his investigation of the U.S. Army's internal security and his disagreements with President Eisenhower was less important than how he was saying it.
When the shouting and the tumult dies, the American people and the President will realize that this unprecedented mudslinging against the committee by the extreme left-wing elements of press and radio was
His primary achievement has been in confusing the public mind as between the internal and the external threats of communism. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember always that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. Now, a sample of an investigation. The witness was Reed Harris, for many years a civil servant in the State Department, directing the Information Service.
The question is, did the Civil Liberties Union supply you with an attorney?
They did supply an attorney.
The answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
You know, the Civil Liberties Union has been listed as a front for and doing the work of the Communist Party.
Mr. Chairman, this was 1932.
Yeah, I know that's 1932. Do you know that they since have been listed as a front for and doing the work of the Communist Party?
I do not know that they have been listed so, sir.
You don't know they have been listed?
I have heard that mention and read that mention.
The Reed Harris hearing demonstrates one of the senator's techniques. Twice, he said the American Civil Liberties Union was listed as a subversive front. The Attorney General's list does not and has never listed the ACLU as subversive, nor does the FBI or any other federal government agency.
It took courage for Murrow and his staff to take on Joe McCarthy, but Murrow was not really saying anything that had not already been said on the radio and in the newspapers. Yet something had changed.
The difference was that Murrow took that penetrating light of television and shot it directly at Joe McCarthy.
The actions of the junior senator from Wisconsin have caused alarm and dismay amongst our allies abroad and given considerable comfort to our enemies. And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear, he merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good night, and good luck.
Over the next couple of days, there were something like 10,000 phone calls to CBS, 75,000 letters, telegrams. There had never been such an avalanche of reaction to any program, and it was 10-1 in favor of Murrow.
Then McCarthy made a fatal mistake. He could have ignored the Murrow program. Instead, he accepted the CBS offer of equal time to reply. And he began his half hour on national television by personally demonstrating the very same smear tactics that Murrow had criticized.
Ordinarily, I would not take time out from the important work at hand to answer Murrow. However, in this case, I feel justified in doing so because Murrow is the symbol, the leader, and the cleverest of the jackal pack, which is always found at the throat of anyone who dares to expose individual communists and traitors.
Until 1954, relatively few Americans had ever seen Joe McCarthy up close at political rallies or fundraising dinners. Most Americans knew him through the newspapers, and McCarthy knew a lot about newspapers and how to use them. But television was new. He did not understand how television could quietly enter living rooms from coast to coast and, in the space of half an hour, quietly change a million minds. Joe McCarthy had no way of knowing that the tide of public opinion was changing.
What Murrow did was to show in a sense, the real face of Joe McCarthy at the worst possible time for the senator.
2 weeks and a day after Joe McCarthy went on television to rebut Edward R. Murrow, the Army-McCarthy hearings began in Washington and on national television. The U.S. Army, demoralized and angered by McCarthy's charges of subversion in the military, had demanded a congressional investigation, charging that Joe McCarthy and his staff had used undue influence, plus threats of even more investigations, to get preferential treatment for a young McCarthy staff member who had been drafted. McCarthy stepped down temporarily as chairman, and, in effect, he went on trial before his own committee. The television audience was fascinated, not so much by the specifics of the Army's case against McCarthy, but by the dramatic struggle that developed between McCarthy and the Army's lawyer, Joseph Welch.
I raise this question.
April 22nd, 1954. McCarthy could have let his young, aggressive assistant, Roy Cohn, handle his case, but instead, he insisted from the start on taking charge of his own defense.
Let me state my position, will you?
Well, I don't.
From the outset, McCarthy acted as if the Army, not he, was on trial. For example, he went after Major General Miles Reber by savaging the general's brother, a retired Foreign Service officer.
Are you aware of the fact that your brother was allowed to resign when charges of that he was a bad security risk were made against him as a result of the investigation of this committee?
Just a minute, General.
General Reber replied candidly.
Until the senator brought this question up a few minutes ago, I had never heard a single word about my brother being investigated in any way by this committee.
But the innuendo lingered, as it was designed to do, as if Reber's testimony was tainted because of his brother. Throughout it all, Joseph Welch, the counsel for the Army, looked on quietly.
For some reason.
The 65-year-old Welch was a prominent attorney and a lifelong Republican.
Joe Welch was the voice of reason. He was from the Midwest. He was very, very calm in his demeanor, almost schoolmarmish. He was the kind of person who always would discipline the bully.
But when? Murray Martyr covered the hearings for the Washington Post.
Those of us in the press, kept waiting there, thinking, when is Welch going to do something, for God's sakes?
Welch bided his time until the 8th week of the hearings.
And then, like a leopard, he pounced at just the most opportune moment.
When you
The pouncing was cumulative, slowly gathering steam as Roy Cohn, McCarthy's right-hand man, was testifying. Cohn, along with his assistant and good friend G. David Shine, had been investigating allegations of subversion at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. The U.S. Army Signal Corps had a secret research installation there.
As early as the spring, which must be March or April, you knew about this situation of possible subversives and security risks and even spies at Fort Monmouth. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And I'm sure the knowledge that you had was a source, Mr. Cohn, to one in your position, of some anxiety for the nation's safety, wasn't it?
It was one situation among a number of serious situations, yes, sir.
Well, I don't know how many worries you had.
Welsh wanted to know why Cohn, reportedly facing a major security problem at Fort Monmouth, had sat on the news, saying nothing, in fact, until after Cohn's close friend G. David Shine had been drafted. Could it be that Cohn was trying to blackmail the Army into giving Shine preferential treatment? That the investigation of subversion in New Jersey had more to do with looking out for Shine than in containing the communist menace?
Mr. Cohn, if I told you now that we had a bad situation at Monmouth, you'd want to cure it by sundown if you could, wouldn't you?
No, I'm sure I couldn't, sir.
Well, but you'd like to if you could.
Sir.
Isn't that right?
No, what I might like to do and what can be done are two different things.
Well, if you could be God and do anything you wished, you'd cure it by sundown, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir.
McCarthy grew increasingly restless as Cohn grew more uncomfortable. Suddenly, the senator struck out at Welsh hard and viciously.
I think we should tell him that he has in his law firm a young man named Fisher, whom he recommended, incidentally, to do the work in this committee, who has been for a number of years a member of an organization which was named, years and years ago, as the legal bulwark of the Communist Party, an organization which always swings to the defense of anyone who dares to expose communists.
Roy Cohn was visibly shocked by McCarthy's retaliatory attack. He stared at McCarthy, shaking his head as if begging him to stop. But McCarthy continued to hack away.
Now, I have hesitated bringing that up, but I have been rather bored with your phony request to Mr. Cohen here that he personally get every communist out of government before sundown. Therefore, we will give you the information about the young man in your own organization.
But McCarthy had overreached, and everyone but McCarthy apparently realized it. Welsh played the moment for all it was worth.
I think that should be in the record.
Senator, you won't need anything in the record when I finish telling you this. Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness.
McCarthy did not even see the knockout punch coming. He had tried to slander a member of Welsh's law firm, a young attorney not connected with the case, and Welsh seized the moment to underline on national television just how sleazy he believed McCarthy's tactics were.
If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman, but your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me.
Mr. Chairman, may I say that Mr. Wells talks about this being cruel and reckless. He was just baiting. He has been baiting Mr. Cohen here for hours.
To those watching on television, it seemed McCarthy simply could not stop himself. He continued to throw mud.
Now, I just give this man's record, and I want to say, Mr. Welch, that it has been labeled long before he became a member, as early as 1944.
Senator, may we not drop this? Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator.
Let's
You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
I'll say it hurts.
Mr. Welch here has been filibustering this hearing. He's been talking day after day about the way he wants to get anyone tainted with communism out before sundown. I know Mr. Cohen would rather not have me go into this.
The cameras showed Roy Cohn biting his lips. Cohn knew how to crush a witness, and he knew that Welch was in a position now to strike his final blow. Not a thunderbolt, but a soft-spoken gentleman's deadly expression of contempt.
Mr. McCarthy, I will not discuss this further with you. You have sat within 6 feet of me and could have asked me about Fred Fisher. You have seen fit to bring it out, and if there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. I will not discuss it further. I will not ask Mr. Cohen any more witnesses. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, call the next witness.
Any questions to come from the members of the judge?
And the audience broke into tremendous applause. McCarthy actually put his hands up in the air like this. What have I done? What have I done? He couldn't quite understand how his performance had affected his popularity.
The next witness was McCarthy himself. He tried to make his case with his maps and charts, but the other senators and the nation had stopped listening.
McCarthy never found a single communist in government.
And it was just nothing but recklessness fueled by alcoholism. I mean, he was a man utterly out of control.
I don't think he understood how destructive his stories were, how ruinous they were. I don't think he understood the incalculable misery and mischief that he created.
That summer, the Senate censured McCarthy and stripped him of his chairmanship by a vote of 67 to 22.
This will make the investigation of communism in government much more difficult. It won't stop us, however. We intend...
Editors would actually tell the reporters, I don't want to hear about Joe McCarthy. You know, when he dies, we'll put him on page 1. But until then, he's going on page 38 behind the truss ads. We don't want to hear from this guy. He is not news anymore.
Joe McCarthy declined so rapidly that he could not get a postmaster approved for his hometown in Wisconsin, and 3 years later he died.
Joseph McCarthy died on May 2nd, 1957. He was 48 years old.
It was a pathetic end, alcoholism. Nobody wanted to be around him. He was turned into a lout, slob, and he was gone.
McCarthyism was a symptom of the climate of fear that plagued America during the Cold War. But when the American people finally saw Joe McCarthy for what he was, they were able to see McCarthyism for what it really was, something truly un-American. And as the country moved away from that dark chapter in our history, we became more skeptical of demagogues and their smear tactics. Abe Lincoln once said that Americans should be touched by the better angels of our nature. His words were not just for his time, but for all time. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century.